This is a conversation with David Gissen. He's a professor of architecture and urban history at Parsons School of Design and the author of acclaimed books like The Architecture of Disability, Subnatures, and Manhattan Atmospheres. In this conversation, we discuss the role of form and function in architecture, naturalism, the concept of subnatures, and the way we view and treat disability in architecture. This is no time. If you like what you see, then do hit subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify, or rate 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. This project runs on your love and support, so if you'd like to see it continue, do consider making a donation on Patreon, Anchor, Instagram, YouTube, pick your poison. If not through financial support, then do consider sharing these episodes. All your likes and comments, they really go a long way. For the forms of love and support, you can follow this channel on Instagram or Twitter, or follow me personally. And now, it's no time. Eugene Viollet-le-Duc.
Sounds good.
You'll have to pardon my French throughout this conversation. He had put forward this theory that a rationally designed structure may not necessarily be beautiful, but no building can be beautiful that does not have a rationally designed structure. Louis Sullivan took this theory and he coined the maxim, form follows function. His apprentice, Flancroyd Wright, took that even further and said, form and function are one, joined in spiritual union. To set the premise for this conversation, I want to stir up this debate once more, and I'm going to ban the words "it depends" and "both matter." What is function? What is form in the context of architecture? And gun to your head, in your heart of hearts, do you believe that form always follows function, or can you make the case that function can also follow form?
Okay. So in an architectural context, when people talk about the term function, they typically mean or trying to describe what a building does or what it's used for. So for example, the function of a tall office building is as a place to work and a place to house offices. The function of a home is as a place to live, a place where, it got many functions, place to cook, place to sleep, place to converse with your family members, among other things. So form in architecture typically describes both the shape of a structure, okay, but also the sensibilities of it as like a physical object. So when Louis Sullivan, who you mentioned, came up with the idea that form follows function, he was addressing the fact that there was no precedent in the 19th century, when he was the late 19th century, when he was working for tall office buildings. It was a unprecedented type of building in cities, and particularly in American cities. And so he wanted to understand if there were, or I should say, he turned to what he believed were like laws of nature, drawn from like biological science, that the physical aspects of creatures that exist in the world emerge from the functions that they satisfy. So, for example, a functionalist biologist would say that our hands satisfy the function of being able to grip objects. Our legs are built to stand and to walk in certain ways. Mm-hmm. And so in an analogous way, he imagined how one could design a tall building in a city that satisfied the necessary use of it as a space in which to work. So that answers the first part of your question.
That answers the first part, yes.
Okay. So can form follows function? Can function follow form?
Yeah.
Well, okay, so
and what do you believe?
So yes, we all deal with this all the time, right? So from an architectural perspective, we inhabit homes or offices, other things in which the physical disposition of it, the shape of it, the physical characteristics of it are so strong that sometimes we have to figure out how to make these spaces work for ourselves, right? So we are definitely figuring out a way in which to make function follow form. And to speak of biology again, all of us have had experiences where, let's say, we've injured our hand or our legs, or we begin to lose our eyesight, and so we have to figure out how to adjust our use of these parts of our bodies because the form of them has somehow been temporarily or permanently altered. Right? All of us at one time in our life has hurt a finger, or jammed a thumb, or hurt a hand, and had to figure out how to use our hands a little bit differently.
Yeah.
So clearly, the functions that we have to do in our daily lives as human beings can follow the the forms that we find ourselves with. Yeah.
Yes. So your stance is yes.
My stance
I'm gonna
is.
make it bigger.
I mean, my stance is that these two things are always informing each other. I mean,
Yeah.
personally, I'm very interested in architects who are working and writing in the 1950s and 1960s in particular, who are very critical of very modernist ideas like Louis Sullivan's and all the people that he influenced that demanded that form follow function. They believed these anti-functionalist architects, let's say, they believe that the forms of buildings should be determined by other things. For example, our cultural needs, our needs as people who exist in history. So for example, if you're building a building in Dubai or a building in Rome, that maybe it's the functions that are happening in the building aren't the most critical thing, but tapping into the traditions of those cities and making buildings relate to or look like or invoke the historic architecture of those parts of the world.
Yep.
And so one shouldn't let function or science, let's say, inform architecture too much, because architecture is also a cultural form, a cultural practice, as much as it is a technical practice of satisfying needs.
Very interesting. I think you've opened up a lot of doors for me. So we're going to quickly explore all of them. First, let's talk about the tall office building. So in an article published in 1896 called The Tall Office Building Artistically Considered, Louis Sullivan had written that whether it be the sweeping eagle in his flight or the open apple blossom, the toiling workhorse, the blithe swan, the branching oak, the winding stream at its base, the drifting clouds, over all the coursing sun, form ever follows function. And this is the law. Where function does not change, form does not change. It is the pervading law of all things organic and inorganic, of all things physical and metaphysical, of all things human and all things superhuman, of all true manifestations of the head, of the heart, of the soul. That life is recognizable in its expression, that form ever follows function. This is the law. Why do you think he coined this to be a law? You touched upon it earlier. Let's expand on it slightly. Do you think it was because form is, to a certain extent, so subjective? It's a subjective experience that what your idea of good form might be very different from someone else's idea. Or let's say a way of rephrasing this question is, it's much easier to derive the objective function of the purpose of a structure rather than the objective form. Would you agree?
Okay. I mean, first of all, this is great. You really should come teach my architectural history class.
No, not at all.
So, I mean, it's so, what do we say about Louis Sullivan? So, I mean, again, like Louis Sullivan was working at a time in which he's in Chicago in the late 19th century. This is a booming city that recently had a fire that destroyed so much of it. And he's rebuilding the downtown of Chicago. He's being hired to do office buildings in many other Midwestern cities. He has an office building here in New York City, in the NoHo district of New York.
Yeah.
And so again, I think he's just really, he's very much struggling with how to come up with a form for this American building type that's unprecedented. And I think one of the things that he's reacting to in that particular passage that you mentioned to was that there was a trend of architects that were working at the same time that he was, that were turning to sort of architectural historical traditions to try to figure out what a tall building should be physically and what it should look like. So for example, they were making tall office buildings look like classical temples, or there were architects in Chicago that were making tall classical buildings tall office buildings look like, invoked like Gothic cathedrals.
Yeah.
And so I think he was very much rejecting that kind of historicism and trying to figure out based upon the ideas of Viollet-le-Duc that you mentioned, he's trying to figure out where does style come from? How do you make a new style? And so for him, based upon his idea was to base buildings upon natural laws, right? Just as we were talking about earlier. If you're asking me what I think about that, I think we're probably going to talk about this in a minute, but I think an architect who believes that their buildings are based upon natural law is in some kind of error. they should rethink how they're imagining their working process or what it is that they're doing.
Hold that thought, because we will talk about it. While we're still talking about form and function, something very interesting you mentioned and brought this follow-up question, which is, how do you view architecture and design, do you view them as background art forms in the sense that if they're done really well, if design is done really well, it's meant to be invisible and seamless, so much so that you don't realize the depth that's gone behind it because it's doing its job so well? Or do you feel like architecture, art, design, it needs to be in your face, scream at you, incite conversation, and like evoke an emotional response and really make you realize the depth of it?
Yeah, personally, I like buildings that make me think. I mean, that's one reason that I love architecture, because for me, I'm always amazed at the capacity for buildings that I experience or see just walking down the street to make me think about ideas about how we might live or how we might inhabit spaces in cities or how we might work or how we might experience art or nature, among many other things. So I think for me, I personally don't like designers or methods of design that aspire for making design an invisible part of life. I like it to be something that we often think about.
Yeah.
One thing I often think about is in the United States, every time we go to wash our hands in a public restroom, it's like a different design experience, right? It's actually a really interesting place to think about design. Also because in this country, bathrooms are like at the center of all kinds of political battles all the time over gender, over privacy, over disability, over any number of things, over environmentalism and water use, right? Hygiene, sanitation. So, you can, like, bathrooms are very interesting places in which you're always thinking about ideas about design in terms of like washing your hands or, using the facilities or drying your hands, right? And so it's fascinating to me how such a simple thing as like washing your hands, for example, can be rethought so many times over by designers up until this day. Like, haven't we solved the problem of how to wash your hands? But designers keep coming up with more and more innovative and provocative ways in which we can do it within a bathroom.
Yeah, I can completely resonate. Like, so many times I don't know how to get the sink working. Like,
exactly, right. It's like, am I invisible?
Yeah,
like, what happened to me?
It's like, that's not, once you see it, it's obvious.
Right.
But
You mean the automatic ones in particular?
The automatic
right.
ones, where's the sensor?
Right.
Or some of the ones have the knobs that are so like seamlessly like integrated. You don't know which one what to turn and stuff.
Like, where does this come from that you're not allowed to touch anything in a bathroom? This is like a theme of the last 10 years.
I guess hygiene, I don't know. I'm no expert. Another interesting thing you mentioned, and then we start talking about nature, which you brought up, is something very interesting where you spoke about the anti-functionalist architects and how they started factoring in cultural influences as well. It's something very, very interesting. And that's, I guess, an argument against function being the leading, like taking up a leading role over form as well, right? You allude to this in your book, The Architecture of Disability, as well, about these biases that are embedded in function and how we need to rethink that. I had this, I'm not a student of architecture or design, but I had this thought about New York in particular, which is if you take these pre-war buildings, let's say in Hell's Kitchen or Upper West or Upper East, depending on who you ask, I feel like the function can be very subjective as well. Like we spoke about form being subjective, but I feel like even function can be so subjective. If you ask the residents to provide a safe, comfortable home, these buildings are there for that. But if you ask other residents of New York City, I would say now the cultural aspect seeps in, where I would say these buildings have to be emblematic of the city in a sense, because they're synonymous with New York's culture, architecture, like they bring up the soul of the city, right? If you step back another layer, people can argue because New York is one of the most important and influential cities in the United States, these buildings have to be emblematic of American ideals, American culture, right? You step back another layer, and this might be my final layer, you can argue that New York is one of the most important and influential cities in the world. It needs to represent global cultures and like humanity, which I think Times Square does to an extent, right? So if you, depending on who you ask, you might get 4 different interpretations of the function itself, which might erode the idea of there might being an objective function. And this conflict of interest might not have overlapping elements. Would you agree or would you disagree?
Well, the like tenement buildings or these like these older 19th century and early 20th century apartment buildings are a great example of that would be in agreement with the anti-functionalists, right? They were built to house a lot of people very cheaply, turn a profit for their owners, right? And house generally immigrants, right? And working people, right? And over the years, they've been transformed to all kinds of things, right? Many of the immigrants in New York who moved into them turned them into places to work. They used them to make things. In the 1960s and 70s, artists moved into them and turned them into like artist studios. And today they're multi-million-dollar co-ops and condos, right? They're luxury apartment buildings.
Look at that.
And yet, right. And yet, if my grandmother was still alive who grew up in a tenement, she would just be, she would be shocked if she went to the Lower East Side and saw her block on Hester Street that a railroad flat tenement in her building now sells for like a couple of $1 million. I mean, it's incredible, right? But that's in a way that's proves the point that people feel an attachment to these this kind of building. They don't want to demolish it; they want to keep it, right? And it feels like it's part of the history of the city, and that it can have myriad uses.
Yeah. No, very interesting.
Yeah.
The trajectory that these buildings have followed. Okay, let's talk about naturalism. And you spoke about what is naturalism in architecture.
Yeah, I use this term a lot in my work, and I wrestle with it. So naturalism is an approach or a belief that the products of human beings can be based upon the laws of nature. We talked about that a little bit already.
Yeah.
So someone who is a naturalist designer would believe that their role as a designer is to make objects that are based on natural laws. So, for example, to quote somewhat anonymously, some famous architects and designers who believe in the importance of naturalism, they would say a tall building should be like a tree.
Yeah.
A home should be designed by the laws of nature. Or there might be other examples that I'm thinking of. Oh, an office structure should be based upon the kinds of ways that people that nature and people interact in the wild. I mean, to cite an extreme example, right? Sure.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want me to jump in, but my problem with naturalism is who gets to determine what the laws of nature are in the first place, right? And then that's an issue, which we're supposedly supposed to base designs on. My other issue with naturalism, and this comes from my experiences as somebody who's lived almost their whole life with disabilities and illnesses, is that it makes almost no place for incapacity, that the people that are naturalist designers look at a tree or look at an animal or look at something in the world, in the wild, based upon its physical capacities. Trees are good and we should base things on trees because they absorb carbon dioxide and produce oxygen.
Yep.
Oysters, there's been a lot of talk about increasing the number of oysters in the rivers and estuaries of New York. Oysters are good because they clean water. Mm-hmm. Well, I see my role as somebody who has spent, again, almost their entire life thinking about being a disabled person. I think my role is to argue for incapacity in our world. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, I would say I am interested in naturalism, even though I often hate the way it's used in architectural and design contexts. But on the other hand, I try to introduce let's call it a philosophy of incapacity that might drive some of our ideas about design. Like, is there a place for us to base our ideas upon things in the world that are weak and frail and don't necessarily function the way that we're told that they're supposed to function, right? And the problem with naturalism, ultimately, if you take it to its extreme, is that it comes very close to ideas from the early 20th century that are often, sometimes people use the word eugenic or eugenicist. And this was the idea that society could control the demographic population through kinds of, by selective breeding, so to speak. I know I'm laughing because it's so extreme. Or by thinking about ways to subtly and not so subtly steer the gene pool of a society or a municipality or a region or a state or a nation towards some kind of idealized end. So again, who gets to determine who those ideals are? And what does that eliminate when we begin thinking about that way? There's all kinds of racial, ethnic, and other kinds of factors that go into eugenicist thinking that are obviously disturbing, to say the least. Anyway, so the larger point is that naturalism is a very influential way of thinking, one that has been renewed because of our fears about the effects of climate change right now. And so there's talks today, for example, of cities should be based upon the laws of nature, or cities have to become more and more governed by the ideas of nature to become healthy places to live. The buildings within our cities have to do that, the objects that we make, et cetera. So again, I understand where people are coming from who have that kind of philosophy, but I'm interested in how the kinds of experiences that people like me have had to deal with find a role within this philosophy or can push back against some of its more extreme variations and concepts.
That's an excellent introduction. You mentioned the pros and cons. So let's explore a bit more and let's add some color to that. So let's steelman both sides of the debate. And let's start by making a case for naturalism. I believe when you were a student in the UK, the idea that nature is fundamental was paramount. And I'm not sure if that's a neo-Marxist idea, but there's this critical theory of nature as well. So let's explore this further. Can you make the case that nature is indeed fundamental and should be the base of architectural theory if you had to steelman that side?
Yeah, I can't. Okay. Yeah, I can't. I mean, when I was in London doing my PhD, the idea that governed a lot of the idea that was governing a lot of the work that we were creating at that time was this idea called the production of nature, which was developed by this Marxist geographer named Neil Smith, who actually spent a large part of his career here in New York City and teaching at the City College. Very influential person who died, I think, about 15 years ago. I'm not quite sure on that. I have to look that up. Anyway, very influential person. And his argument was that in the era of capitalism and industrialization, that every aspect of the natural world has been reworked by human beings. So arguing for naturalism is in some ways a mistake because the nature that surrounds us, that we imagine as being external to us, is something that we've created. A great example of that was an article that was in the papers just last week about how the removal of so much groundwater out of farmlands in the US, as well as glacial melting due to climate change, is actually shifting the axis of the Earth slightly. That the North Pole has actually shifted several miles in one direction or another. Anyway, the larger point is that our impact on the natural world is so extensive and extreme that it even is affecting like the axis of the Earth.
Yeah.
So an idea like that makes it very hard to be a quote unquote naturalist, because naturalism argues that there's this thing, nature, that's outside of us. And if we could only figure out how to get closer to it, then society would be better, right? I don't agree with that.
Yeah, the production of nature theory was very interesting.
Oh, let me add one more thing just for a pro thing. On the other hand, I do recognize that like the extensive use of like more and more concrete and steel in the buildings in our city, or other kinds of materials that involve like enormous amounts of extraction and pollution and the creation of ever increasing amounts of carbon are bad, right? So I do think it's very good that my architectural colleagues and others and people in the building industry are really rethinking about like how we build buildings and the materials that go into them. Like I have no argument with that at all. I think that's very important work, So I think like doing that is very critical, but also thinking not like a naturalist, but understanding like the social and urban and other kinds of economic kinds of worlds that kind of thinking intersects with is very critical, as much as, let's say, the natural world that one is trying to protect.
It's only fair we now make the case against it. Let's steelman that side. You already mentioned the production of nature theory, how nature has already been reproduced like a ship of Theseus. So like, what is nature now if we assume it's fundamental, but like what Needham argues has already been reworked and reproduced. You've also said in a previous interview that naturalism, and you alluded to it now, provides this crutch for ignoring the biases that are embedded within nature. So let's add some color to this. What is your case against naturalism? I mean, you've already covered a lot of the points, but I guess if you have any other points you want to add, why do you think it's a wrong approach to take? That's a base for architecture theory.
I mean, so there's a race-based critique of naturalism that argues that the quote unquote laws of nature were ones that are discovered and advanced by like white Europeans who are arguing for what the principles of nature are. So there's like a racial critique that there's many ways to understand nature, and from numerous perspectives. There's a decolonial, to use a fashionable term, critique of naturalism that argues that so many of the quote unquote naturalists were colonialists. And that, how do societies that experienced colonialism have differing ideas about nature and structure? So what I think I offer is what I call a disability critique of naturalism, which I mentioned earlier, which is just that all forms of naturalism lean on or rely on the idea that nature is inherently about the capacities of things. And so I argue, like, how can we bring in the idea of incapacity? And what would that mean? I don't know if I have the answer to that, but I can give some examples of people that work with nature and who have introduced ideas about impairment and weakness that I think are very interesting. So here's one. So a lot of people that are that think of themselves as adhering to or have allegiances to a naturalist philosophy often talk about trees and try to mimic or relate to the structure of trees, which they idealize. Trees have very efficient use of physical structure. So for an architect, they're very interesting.
Yep.
They perform all kinds of metabolic functions by converting all kinds of pollutants into the air into less polluting things. One of the chief ones today being turning carbon into oxygen, as I mentioned. They provide shade. Okay. So there's this architecture firm in the Netherlands called Westgate. They're landscape architects. And they did a very interesting project in Madrid, Spain, which is a city that has a long history of creating these kinds of boulevards that you see all over Europe, in which you see these rows and rows of trees kind of held upright and trimmed to look perfect. So in this project that they did that was completed relatively recently, they went to a nursery or an area where they're growing trees. And there were all these trees that were bent and crooked and kind of deformed. And they were pretty large. They were pine trees that were twisted. And they were deemed unsuitable for urban use because they had such disfigured shapes. And so they would be destroyed by this nursery. So they actually said, we want to use those trees and plant them. It was really interesting. So they selected hundreds, I believe, of these. I saw this project. I'm not sure how many trees it had, but it was many, many trees. Let's say dozens and dozens and dozens of these trees. And they planted them in this park in something kind of like a boulevard. And then because these trees couldn't hold themselves up, they designed these bright red crutches. These things look like crutches to hold them up. And the experience of it is wonderful because for someone like myself, who's used crutches, who's used a wheelchair, walks on artificial limbs now, like just seeing this image of frailty and weakness and disability, very broadly conceived, built into a public urban space was really exciting. And it felt like there was like a kind of place for the way I understand my own body, right? My own nature, so to speak, within and to be reflected into the built environment around me. It was, it's thrilling. Yeah.
I remember seeing
a model project.
Yeah, I remember seeing the pictures of this project in one of your books as well, and it was all your books. I must say have like unlocked ways in which like I would never think of these things. Right, just like never thought about like when I walked on a boulevard and I see trees that are perfectly straight, perfectly pruned, and you never think about like the artificial emotion it's evoking out of them, but like getting them in the more natural state and the kind of emotion it would.
And the subtle messages they send also.
Exactly. Yeah. Amazing books. And they all like really made me think that way. I have this paragraph from your book, Subnatures, which I think summarizes this idea. And then we'll talk a bit more about some of the subnatures. You say in the book that subnatures challenge the reductive and naturalistic aspects of contemporary architecture and nature dynamics, promoting a dialectic that radically rethinks both architecture and nature, and helps us understand how certain ideas about nature are historically driven, socially and architecturally. I cannot argue that subnature will make people's experiences of architecture more pleasant or peaceful, but I do believe that provides us with the intellectual and historical conceptualization of nature that many architects and architecture theorists have craved. Found that really, really powerful. So you're at its core, if I get it right, you're trying to reduce like these exclusionary aspects of nature and these elements that have traditionally been considered repulsive, like smoke, for example. You're trying to revisit the dialogue around it and try to integrate them into design, right?
I mean, I would define subnature as all of the kinds of forms of natural matter, so to speak, very broadly defined, that get produced in cities and that are seen as, sometimes people use the word externalities, the unwanted outcomes of industrial modernization and of modern life. Things like smoke, weeds, pigeons. We can talk about that maybe a little bit more in a minute. It's interesting. Rubble, right? Among many, many other kinds of things. And so my project in that book was to create a kind of almost like a guidebook to how to think about these and understand them both historically, and architects at the time I wrote the book, which is about 15 years ago, architects that were trying to find a way to like work with these materials. Yeah.
Rem Koolhaas had once said that you talk about beauty and you get boring answers, but if you talk about ugliness and things get really interesting.
Oh, I like that. I haven't heard that before.
Yeah, and I think you've taken that idea and made things really interesting within naturalism. Let's explore the idea of subnatures with a rapid fire game.
Okay. All right.
I'm going to list down some subnatures, and in 90 seconds or less, it's an unfair limit. I would love it if you can talk about the ideas these subnatures represent in contemporary architecture, maybe an example of a project that represented.
As a college professor, I'm paid to speak longer than 90 seconds. So I'll try. I don't know if I can do this. All right.
I'm not hard on the limit. If we have a good idea, we can explore
Okay,
it.
how about 95 seconds?
95 seconds, but you get -1 point for that.
Okay.
Let's start. Are you ready?
Okay.
First one, pigeons.
Pigeons. Okay. I would bet that 90% of New Yorkers don't know that pigeons were brought to New York City as food. They were brought here. Yeah, look at your face. They were brought here they were one of the primary protein sources of European immigrants in New York, believe it or not. That's why we have so many pigeons here. They were bred here as things to eat. They were like, the chicken tenders of the 19th century. And so as protein sources shifted in American diets from pigeons to things like we eat beef, we eat pork, we eat, many other kinds of animals, obviously, the pigeons suddenly became these useless animals. So they were no longer raised as food. And suddenly there are all these pigeons that eventually became undomesticated and feral all over the city. So these pests that we see around the city were actually something we once ate.
Wow. Yeah. Often described as rats of the sky or cockroaches of the sky. But in your book, you had described them as, I think, free nature within modernity. I thought it was a very beautiful way of looking at pigeons as well. Second one, exhaust.
Exhaust. Okay. There's a really fascinating building in New York City called the Washington Bridge Apartments that I encourage everybody to go see. It's at the end of the the George Washington Bridge in Washington Heights neighborhood. That building was built over a highway and was part of a plan in the 1960s and 1970s to use the kind of canyons that were created by highways as potentially developable sites for residences.
Yeah.
And when those buildings were designed, they were also the first aluminum skinned apartment buildings built in New York City, maybe in the United States. They were seen as being built above this fairly, frankly, disgusting exhaust-ridden space above a highway. And the architects were trying to figure out how to turn that into developable space. So on the one hand, a kind of frightening idea about how to build within a space filled with exhaust. But on the other hand, a kind of project wrestling with the destruction that was often wrought by highways and trying to figure out how to bring people to live back in spaces where they used to live and that were displaced by highway construction. When they first proposed it, they were supposed to, one of the problems was when they first proposed that project in the very late 1950s and early 60s, they were supposed to cover in all the spaces between the apartments so none of the exhaust from the highway would make it up to street level or to the level of the apartments. But they ran out of money, never built it. And so they created this building that is, very, I guess the fair word is a place of a lot of environmental struggle for its residents.
And very unique as well. I've not seen any buildings that are like taken up the real estate above a highway.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Final one, crowds.
Crowds. Oh my God. I mean, now that the pandemic is finally winding down, we can really understand the thrill of crowds, right? In a way, and of being close to people and sharing air, right? And within visions or dreams by architects and urbanists and others of modern cities, one of the things that really excited them about cities was it a place where you could experience our bodies commingling, right? And so I think the pandemic has, been hard for all of us for any number of financial reasons, psychological reasons, among others. I think it's exciting now that we can maybe return to the experience of the crowd in New York City. Many of us, and of course, some of us still have to be careful about our health. But yeah, crowds are a very exciting and central part of the experience of a modern city.
If you had asked me 5 years ago, I would say, no, crowds. It's always a negative connotation. But after the pandemic, everyone was happy to see people around, see the traffic. We were celebrating this traffic jam on the road means people out and about. It switched so immediately, and it took a pandemic to.
I never knew how pleasant it would be to smell somebody else in public. I don't have a mask on.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, just seeing people about and being stuck in a crowd. Yeah. It just something about it represents something very positive. But you're right. It took the pandemic. It took something that
for us to understand how special that is.
Great performance. 3 out of 3. I'll send a trophy your way. So keep an eye on your mail.
All right, thank you.
Let's move into the topic we've been building towards, and you alluded to as well. Let's talk about the architecture of disability and the philosophy of disability as well. In 2007, I think you were walking down a path to the Acropolis of Athens. And for a student of history, architecture, and design, this should have been a joyous experience for you. But by the end of it, you were pretty frustrated.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that story. What happened on that walk? What did you see? What did you feel? And what did that tell you about the philosophy of disability?
So as somebody who studied architecture in the United States, I've had one professor after the other, some quite famous, talk about how their experience of walking to the top of the Acropolis in Athens, Greece, going from the bottom and winding up. It's about 300-foot climb. Maybe a bit more than that, but off the top of my head, that's what I remember. Maybe it's okay. And not only did they talk about how important this experience was for them in terms of being an architect, but they talked about how people in history had this experience going way back to 250 years of people going to the Acropolis when it was part of the Ottoman Empire and walking up to the top, Le Corbusier, Louis Kahn, on and on and on. Okay, so when I was fortunate enough to be able to afford a trip to Athens as a guest, the first thing I did after the plane landed was take a taxi to the foot of the Acropolis and do this climb because I'd heard so much about it. Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, I wear an artificial leg, and I don't necessarily walk like someone who's very has both their limbs and very physically capacitated. So I went up this very famous walk, and I was so angry at the end of the walk. First of all, it's extraordinarily arduous. Okay, so that made me annoyed. But the thing that made me the most angry that was that the walk that I walked on, and I knew this before, the walk that I walked on, the path, was built in the 1950s and early 1960s. Okay. And originally, 2,500 years ago, the Acropolis was reached by a series of enormous and gently sloping ramps. And almost nobody knows this. And so it annoyed me because these architects who wrote about the kind of torturous experience to get to the top and how difficult it was and that they made it and how great the experience was, it wasn't necessarily, let's say, an authentic experience of the building, right? It was one that was built into it over time and one that became more and more kind of celebrated in the 20th century and like literally built into the experience of it in the 1950s, in which this architect made a path which many architects think is like a wonderful, beautiful experience, and it is very, striking and pleasant to look at, but it's one that really demands a lot from your body. It gets increasingly steep as you get to the top, and it has more and more stairs as you get towards the top, and you eventually walk on this narrow single file path before you get to the entry to the Acropolis.
Yeah.
And all of that is designed. That is not part of the history of this place, okay? And it's one that works against the way that the site was reached so long ago, right? Yeah. And so when you go to the Acropolis and then you walk down, you go to the Acropolis Museum at the base of the Acropolis, they actually have a model of what the Acropolis looked like with these ramps. And when I looked at that, I thought, oh my God, like they're rebuilding everything at that site, which I may take issue with, to look like it did 2,500 years ago. Why don't they build the ramps if they're so obsessed with the particular experiences and ideas of what this looked like 2,500 years ago? But I think one of the reasons those things aren't built is because I think the arduousness of getting to the top has been written about by so many people that it's become seen as part of like the necessary experience of the place. Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think we put a premium on this art value or the age value where physical capacity is so tightly coupled with being an admirer of these historical places? Like you have to be able to walk these thousands of miles or climb 10,000 steps to get to those ruins. And if you don't do it that way, you're not experiencing it properly.
Yeah.
Why do you think this is so tightly coupled so it ends up alienating people who might not have that physical capacity?
Yeah, I mean, I write about this in my book, The Architecture of Disability, that you mentioned. I mean, I think it's an idea about how knowledge is created. There's this belief, I think, in its origins are in Europe, but it's certainly traveled to the United States and Canada, that like physical exertion somehow is like a pathway to knowledge of the world, right? And that and it's particularly tied up with knowledge of like deep history, so that like ruins and archaeology have to be experienced under physical duress. If this sounds like super intellectual, look at Indiana Jones and those movies. It's a great example of how this idea gets like pushed into popular culture, that the discovery of the past, the discovery of history is one that that's the most extreme example, right? But it's one that probably everybody knows, but one that involves like, taking one's body to like a physical extreme, right? It's absurd, but it's part of a belief system that's kind of in the woodwork of a kind of European understanding of history and archaeology.
Yeah. How did that come about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't gotten into the origins of it, but it's a great question. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. Like I think it's part of the history of like the Romantic movement in the early 19th century, in which the feelings of like physical duress suddenly become written about in poetry and produced in artworks that show figures and people, or in poetry and writing in which people talk about their difficult experiences of the world somehow being more like true and authentic experiences of the world. Yeah.
Very interesting the way it was romanticized, like these physical capacity, and that walks hand in hand with being able to appreciate these areas of historical significance. Very interesting. I think you saw something similar at the Basilica of Saint Denis. You'll have to pardon my French.
Yeah, no, sounds great.
Yeah, sounds great. Where exactly what you mentioned, where disabilities, if you look at the historical context behind the Acropolis, they had these ramps built around, but now disability is viewed as this technical problem that needs to be solved.
Yeah.
And what you're asking for in your work and your research is we need to revisit the dialogue that we are having and look at ways in which we can integrate part of the design.
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning that. So that's a very important part of this whole story. So when I went to the Acropolis, and somebody could experience today, there's an elevator that you can take to the top if you're a disabled person. Yeah. And so when I went there, it's been rebuilt, but when I went there, it was very rickety. And I thought, there's no way I'm going up that. Like frightening. It was like a modified construction elevator. You know, it looked very, it didn't look safe to me. Yeah. And they've since rebuilt it. What was I going to say? Yeah. So the larger point is that today, when these sites address disability or visitors that have impairments of various sorts, they make these kinds of accessibility adjustments. And so the message to disabled people is like, now you are welcomed into these historic sites. But when you look at history, the Acropolis, the Basilica at Saint Denis that you mentioned, these are all places that disabled people went to, at the Acropolis 2,500 years ago, Basilica Saint Denis, disabled people have been visiting that church since its construction, both because they're just disabled worshipers, or also because the belief within Catholic belief that touching relics or praying for people that are, ill or need, medical help, the idea that one goes to a church to address one's, ailments, right, is something that, I'm sure many people can relate to. So the idea that like we have to make these technical fixes to relate disabled people to them, I think is a bit wrong-headed. I think we should understand the way disabled people have helped create the culture around these places in the first place. And we should invite people like myself or other disabled people to think about what these buildings might become beyond just like installing a ramp or, like a contemporary like ramp to get up a stair, or installing an elevator to help somebody get into it. Like we made these places historically, right? Yeah. And that's important for people to understand.
Do you think they have their hearts in the right place, or is there something else that's at work where they think that they're solving a problem, but it's just about not involving people in the conversation? It's just like the easiest fix.
Yeah,
Let's go for that.
I think people look at disabled people as like kind of sad or pitiable and in need of aid and help. And so they don't understand that like someone like me is, is a designer and an author and somebody who can like inform what the future of a place is. There's this sense of like that, like we need to help the disabled people, which I think I want to say it comes from a good place. It doesn't come from a bad place, but there's this expression in the disability community, nothing about us without us, which which is very important. And so
what does that mean?
Nothing about us without us. It's like, don't address our needs without talking to us about what our needs are in the first place. Yeah. Right.
Okay.
So, I think in these contexts, I think I'm talking about something much more involved, in which people like myself and many other colleagues of mine who work throughout the world, who understand architecture history, archaeology, disability, can really begin to inform what these places might become. So, for example, just to give example to your listeners of something that I worked on. So I worked on a project with an archaeologist and a classical art historian to reconstruct some artifacts from the Acropolis that were from 2,500 years ago and that relate to disabled people. So we reconstructed the ramp and sort of explained what it was, and so people can understand it better. And the thing that I love that we reconstructed was that 2,500 years ago, when you walked to the top of the Acropolis, there were seats for people to sit because it's exhausting to go up 300 feet, right? Yep. And so we reconstructed these seats in a variety of different forms. Nobody knows what they look like. So we speculated as to what they might be like and made them out of stone and made these very interesting things that people that sit differently because they're disabled or impaired or big or small can use. So that was a wonderful project that is now in Athens, actually. Just these reconstructions have now traveled at Athens, and they're currently on display at the Kanalopolis Museum in Athens at the foot of the Acropolis. So it's very exciting that this work has come around after almost 16 years.
When I read your book and watched interviews, it just unlocked these ways of thinking about things that I've never even considered in my life. So yeah, really powerful books. Highly recommend The Architecture of Disability.
Thank you.
Anyone interested? Let's start wrapping up. Before we move to final questions, I would love it if you can interpret what I've built with a Lego. I have an answer ready for mine.
Well, you are clearly not a functionalist, which I admire. Right?
Thank you.
I like that you've referred to. The viewers can't see. We have a wonderful arch here, and this building is both historic and very contemporary. Look at these cantilevers. Oh, and you even put a pitched roof. Honestly, this is very. You're not an architect?
I put my sign on it.
This is very good. It's very talented. No, I'm serious. This is very good. Yeah, very strong. Yeah, I like how it's symmetrical in the front, sort of, and then on the side, it has some more physical interest. Oh, and I like that you're creating places for shade. Very right. It's July right now in New York City. It's very important. Yeah.
I wish I could tell you thought about it.
Thank you for sharing that with me.
Yeah. While you're talking about the Washington Bridge apartments, I just felt like maybe this is like a crude representation of the Washington Bridge apartments with the highway in the middle. Who knows? Okay.
Oh, I also like a lot of color variation in there too. It's very nice. It's very good.
I wish I could tell you put all that thought into it. Who knows? Yeah, I thought about the shade as well in July. Unfortunately, it doesn't stand. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
No function there.
That's a small detail of buildings.
A mild inconvenience for a structure. Let's move into our final questions. What are some books, movies, role models that have strongly influenced you in your life?
Oh, right. Okay. I mean, one of the book that made me want to become an architect was a book about Roman architecture. I was 10 years old. I can't remember how old I was, and it was this history of like the Roman house.
Yeah.
And at that point, I eventually grew up in a city in America, but at that point, I grew up in the suburbs. And looking at these Roman houses, and they had atria in them, and all these other kinds of spaces, it was. It completely opened my mind, not just to what architecture could be that was so different than the kinds of things you see built in this country.
What was the name? Sorry.
It was just a book of. It was actually a book that was given to me in a Latin class that I was taking as a young child. Yeah. Of just reconstructions of Roman houses from Pompeii. So I can't remember the exact title, but any book on Pompeii would probably have these. And then also it opened my mind to architectural history and how exciting, and how architectural history can make you think about how you live in such a different way. Yeah.
Movies, role models.
Movies. Oh, there's a movie that I screened recently for a film festival on architecture in Copenhagen that I very much recommend. It's by a contemporary. It's called I Didn't See You There by Reed Davenport. Reed is a disabled filmmaker here in New York City, and he made a film about his experiences living in Oakland, California, and his neighborhoods. Reed uses a wheelchair. It's a fantastic movie for understanding what the city is like from the perspective of somebody in a wheelchair. And there are some things in there about access, but it's more about his everyday interactions with people around him. I think it's a great contemporary film. It's on, I think you can stream it on PBS. Yeah.
Okay. Sounds very interesting. I'm going to check it out.
Yeah.
Who was or is the greatest architect or designer of all time, and why?
I
agree.
The greatest. Yeah. Oh my God. Well, I don't even know if I can answer that. The GOAT. I mean, okay.
It's an unfair question.
Yeah. There's an architect that I'm obsessed with who's, let's say, I have to give a lot of preface because he's sort of been canceled recently. So there's I lived in Vienna for some time as part of my career as a visiting professor there. And when I lived there, I got to know more and more about the architecture of Adolf Loos. Adolf Loos is a very difficult person. He wrote some very disturbing things about histories of modern architecture, but he was also such an unusual architect. He was also completely deaf, which I didn't know, and I learned when I lived in Vienna. He worked for the city and did all these buildings for disabled veterans. And he was just such an interesting architect. And most people understand him as an architect of like luxury villas, which is what he's most famous for. But he has this like very big range of kinds of work that he did in the city and the way he thought about the city. And so I just became very obsessed with him. I don't know. I would definitely not say he's the greatest architect of all time, but he's somebody whose thinking constantly provokes my own in terms of how I think about architecture, and somebody who whose career really wound down like about 100 years ago. So it's interesting that somebody could have that kind of lasting impact.
Very interesting. Sorry, why was he cancelled? Was it because of his work or because something in his personal life?
Well, when he was trying to theorize what a modern architecture was, he really embraced this idea that a modern architecture was of a kind of like European West, and he positioned that against the rest of the world. And so he was making, which of course I disagree with, but he was making an argument for modernization as being a Western project, and comparing unfavorably the architectures and cultures of the rest of the world, of Africa, of China. When somebody brings his readings into a class of mine or something, it's like you always, oh, God, I can't believe you wrote that. You just cover your face and you don't, I don't believe you explain somebody away. Like I would never excuse that writing, So he's a difficult figure. The thing that is so important, I think, is that he's not alone. There are so many people that are so central to the development of modern architecture, including Louis Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright, who all did exactly what he was doing. They all made this argument for modernity, often in contrast to like a Western modernity in positive contrast to the negative view of the rest of the world and their cultures. So I think it's something that we have to wrestle with when we think about what modernity and modernization or modernism is in architecture and design today. It has a very inglorious history. But anyway, despite all that, and I realize some listeners or viewers may have a problem with me saying this, I remain endlessly provoked by, not endlessly, that's an absurd statement, but I remain provoked by Loos and many of the things that he was trying to do in Vienna, particularly his work after World War I, as I mentioned, when he was doing all this work with like disabled veterans and trying to reimagine what housing would be in Vienna. Really interesting work, yeah.
And I resonate with you. I grew up with so many authors that I read about that later got canceled, artists. How do you separate the art from the artist? And like, how do you wrestle with that idea of like, so Michael Jackson, for example, grew up with his music.
Right,
Right. It's such a tough debate. And
they're always men, which is, I think, another thing that we have to like wrestle with always, right? These people.
Comedians as well. So it's just always, it's so tough. So I completely resonate with that. Which is the greatest man-made structure of all time and why? Unfair questions galore. Let's go.
Oh my God. The greatest man-made structure of all time. New York City, I mean, as like an entirety. It's nice to think of the city as like one gigantic man-made structure. I don't know if it's the greatest, but it's one that like, again, you just like always provokes me, always thinking about. But it is really one gigantic man-made structure between the underground to the subway, the foundations of the buildings, to the towers, to the bridges, the water system, the electrical system, the management of the air over our heads by people at airports. Like it is an entirely man-made place. So I don't know if it's the greatest, but it's the one that I think I find the most inspiring in my life.
Definitely. Yeah, it's a great
And here we are.
Here we are. I'm great with thinking about this is one giant structure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so fascinating. Last two questions. What would you like your legacy to be?
My legacy. I mean, I think writing this new book on the architecture of disability was really important because I felt like I was finally able to feel comfortable saying, like, I am a disabled person. I have gone through this discipline of architecture in many roles as a student, as a graduate student, as a practicing architect for a while, as an intern, as somebody who helped build things, as now later in life as a historian, as an academic, as a teacher. And so I just think now, today, that my answer might change in 5 or 10 years. I have 5 or 10 years, but I really think this perspective that I brought as a disabled person in our discipline and what needs to change in our discipline, I think is really important. I think it's the most important work that I'm doing. Yeah, no, it was a very, very powerful book. And yeah, I definitely recommend everyone checks out Architecture. You're definitely building a rich legacy, 100%. Thank you.
Final question. Yeah. What do you think is the meaning of life, David Gissen?
The meaning of life. The meaning of life for me, and I don't know if I'm good at this, is to try to live a life that somebody else is going to want to live and to enable that possibility. I think that's, that is the meaning, is a meaning of life, right? That could be your family, that could be your spouse, your partner, that could be your students, but trying to be an example, I think is important, especially today. Yeah. I don't know if that's the meaning of life, but that's an important goal, I think. I think about that a lot. Yeah, I don't want to be that person who's like, people think like, I do, these days, again, we're talking about canceling. You don't want to be that person that nobody wants to be, And I think it's our responsibility, particularly as educators, to offer the reverse, to create some kind of model or pathway for space people to open up for people to be who they want to be.
The meaning of life is to create this pathway that others would want to walk on as well. I think that's a beautiful meaning to have. David, thank you so much. If we want to connect with you, find out more about your work, get the Architecture of Disability, where can they do so?
From the publisher, University of Minnesota Press, from Amazon, of course, and from bookstores. McNally Jackson here in New York City carries it.
David, it was a privilege talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you again. It was really great. Enjoyed it.